This lesson introduces two functions for pandas, read CSV and read Excel, that are essential for importing data. It also covers the use of toDateTime, which can be used to convert a series containing strings to pandas date times, which can then be used as the index of a data frame. We'll start by opening the Lesson 14 notebook. And then we'll run a few cells just to see what the assignment asks us to do. In the first problem, we're going to read in two files, gs10.csv and gs10.xls. Both of these have been downloaded from FRED, the Federal Reserve Economics Database. We're going to use pandas to import data, so we start by importing pandas. We're going to use the command pandas read CSV to read the files. The files are located in the subdirectory data, and so we put data/gs10.csv. The data in GS10 is loaded into a data frame. So we look at the head when we run the cell. We can see we have two columns, date and GS10. This isn't the way we want to load the data normally, especially when we have a set of dates, and we want the dates to be the index. So we're going to import it again using a different set of options. We'll start with the same command, and I'm going to add two optional keyword arguments. As you can see, read CSV has a lot of optional arguments and is a very flexible function. In this case, we're going to use some of the more basic ones. In particular, I'm going to use index call, and I'm going to tell it I want date to become the index column. The other thing I'm going to do is tell read CSV that I want it to parse the dates, and so I set parse dates equal to true. So I read the cell again, and we can see the second time has done a much better job. In particular, we can see that the date is now the index, which is really useful since we can do all sorts of operations on the index, for example, getting all the data in the 1950s. We can also take a look at the index to see what structure it has. Here you can see it's a datetime index. If I hadn't used parse dates, this column would actually contain strings. And so normally you want to let pandas go ahead and parse the dates. We can take a look at the CSV file. In this case, it's really basic. It has two columns, no other information at the top, except for the variable names. This is really a minimal CSV, but in fact is the simplest format to import into Python. We can also see the Excel file is here. We can't open in Visual Studio Code because it's a binary file, but we can open in Excel and take a look at the structure. The first thing you see is it's not as well formatted. It doesn't have the data at the top of the file, and in fact the data starts after 10 rows. That 10 is going to play an important role when we actually import the data. We also want to check at the bottom to make sure there's nothing past the end of the data. We can see in this case there is nothing there. If there were values there, those could actually end up showing up when we import the data. We close the file and let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and I'll start a new cell. First, we'll import it with the basic usage of pandas read Excel. If we take a look at the head, we're not going to like what we see. In particular, it's reading all of the data that's in both columns, and some of them have missing values. It doesn't have the right variable names, and so this is not what we want. I'm going to go back to my command, and I'm going to tell it I want to skip rows, and I'm going to set this value equal to 10. That's the most important thing we need to do here. I want to skip the 10 rows and then import the data again. As you can see, we have something a bit better. We have observation date and GS10 in the two columns. But again, I usually want the date to be the index. So in this case, I'm going to tell read Excel to set the index equal to observation date. And with that change, when I run the cell again, we can see we have a well-formatted file that has one column, GS10, and uses observation date as the index. Here, we don't have to call any additional commands like parse date because Excel knows that this is a date time column. And so when pandas reads in the data, it actually reads from Excel the fact this is dates, and it automatically converts these to Python or pandas date times. If we take a look at the index, we can see it has the same structure as what we had in the previous import. The next problem asks us to directly convert the dates ourselves, so we're going to start by reading the CSV file. We're not going to use any commands to set the index or parse dates. When I import the data again, it's going to have two columns, just like we had at the top, and then nothing's going to be parsed. So I need to do two things. I'm going to need to pull out the dates, I'm going to need to convert them to date times, and then I'm going to need to set them as the index. So I start using the dictionary syntax to pull out dates, and then I'm going to convert it to a date time index using pandas to date time. This function automatically attempts to convert the format if it recognizes it. If it doesn't, you can actually provide some information about the format of your date times. The dates here are formatted in a basic format with year, month, day, and pandas will automatically recognize this style. So I need to use date rather than dates, but aside from that, everything works as expected. If we take a look at the parse dates, we can see we have a series with the right number of observations. In particular, it has a date time dtype. Finally, we can set this at the index by popping it on to the index property of our data frame. If we take a look at the head, it's very close to what we want, but it's not quite right. We can actually see there are still two columns, date and GS10, and so I need to remove the date column. I can do this using the del command, which we encountered before when we looked at dictionaries. Del removes keys from dictionaries, and it works on pandas data frames in the exact same way. If I run this command and then take a look at head, we can see the column is gone, and finally I have the file in a format that I want. This approach is useful when you might have messy data or data that has dates spread across multiple columns. For example, sometimes data is stored with the year in one column, the month in another column, and the day in a third column. This lesson introduced two functions that are important when importing data. The first, read CSV, is useful for importing CSV data and other text file formats. Two inputs are particularly important: index call, which can be used to directly set the index column, and parse dates, which tells read CSV to attempt to parse any dates that it finds in the file. The other, read Excel, imports Excel files. It also supports index call to set the index column, and in general, parse dates is not usually needed. Finally, we saw how toDateTime can be used to convert a series of strings to date times, which can then be inserted into the index by directly assigning to the index property of a series or data frame.